as a hush falls over the crowd. So thank you all for coming. What a delightful evening. This is a milestone moment. What we live and breathe every day started about 50 years ago with a collection of people, many of whom are here. So I can't tell you how excited I am about bringing this program together. I'm Daniel Lewin. I'm the CEO of the museum. Been here about 5 years now. For those who don't know, the mission of this institution is to decode technology, the computing past, the digital present, and the future impact on humanity. Because as you all know, life doesn't exist without computing for all of us and most other people on the planet. So what you're going to see tonight is really the beginning of it all in terms of, again, the way we interact with computers on so many different fronts. And it's particularly exciting that we also have a wonderful look into the future as planned for the program. We've got some of the seminal researchers thinking about the future of computing. And in the last days, months, certainly no more than 5 or 6 months, the world has changed radically. And we've got some people here tonight who are going to share some thoughts on that front. And so I'm not going to dwell any longer. I want to make sure we just get on with the program. But before I do that, I want to thank Arista for their support for this program. So please join me in thanking Arista. These are difficult times for cultural institutions, so if you're not a member, please join. If you'd like to give, you know where to go on the web. There's a little button that says give. We appreciate that. And so without further ado, let me introduce Marguerite Gong Hancock. She's Vice President at the museum, in charge of programming and all of our innovation activities around these kinds of programs. So Marguerite, please join me.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Well, I want to add my warm welcome to each one of you here tonight. As we begin, let's start with a famous quote from Alan Kay, who's at the heart of the story that we're telling tonight. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. And tonight we're going to explore how researchers have tried to invent the future, going back to Palo Alto, Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in 1973, and then, as Daniel said, at Leading Labs today. Our first panel is really going to explore one of the most significant breakthroughs in computing history, and when they brought to life the Alto, which was thinking about the office of the future. It's foundational, of course, for personal computing as we know it today. Laser printing, word processing programs, Ethernet started with Alto, and we can still see the long shadow of Alto. It's network personal computer with a monitor, a mouse, and graphical user interface. Of course, it's no accident how influential it was on a whole generation of researchers, as well as people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and many others. Its impact is staggering, really, on many dimensions. Alan Kay noted a few years ago that the Alto system team numbered around 35 people, spent about what would be equivalent to $10 million or so in today's dollars, and ultimately has led to, you could say, trillions of dollars of wealth creation. It was a time machine that transported computing 15 years into the future with its groundbreaking features and functions that still feel very familiar 50 years later. So tonight, as part of the first program, we're going to feature a conversation among pioneers who are part of the creation of Alto. They will discuss its origins and impact, as well as PARC's unique culture that led to that. Unfortunately, Alan cannot be with us tonight, this evening. We exchanged emails earlier today. He is watching from London in his home. So Alan, this is for you today. We're so grateful for you collaborating with our team to put together this program. We're grateful you allowed us to capture your thoughts on video to share on this historic occasion tonight. And we're grateful that you worked with so many to bring these new Alto demos that are in the museum this week. And most importantly, I just want to and that's the feeling we have. We want to thank you, Alan, for your profound impact on computing and each of our lives today. So please, let's give Alan a thank you. The second hour program will feature distinguished computing pioneers who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible today, and I'll introduce them later in the night. So let's meet our first panel. As is tradition, I'll introduce them using 5 numbers. First, we have Butler Lamson, 6 megahertz Alto clock, 500 DPI, slot resolution, the BCC 500 machine, 3333 on Coyote Hill Road, the PARC address, very familiar to many of you, 500,000 bits on the Alto screen, and 28 years working at Microsoft. He is one of the designers of Xerox Alto, as well as the SDS 940 time-sharing system, their Xerox 9700 laser printer, and several programming languages. He's retired as a technical fellow at Microsoft and an adjunct professor at MIT. Please join us in welcoming Butler Lamson. Next, we have Charles Simoni. Here are his 5 numbers. 1,500 vacuum tubes in his first personal computer, 1,700 Danish crowns on his first paycheck. You can do the translation, I guess. 20, the number of transistors owned when he stopped counting. 1.2 billion active users of Microsoft Office 365, and 450 times traveled around the world. Charles worked at Xerox PARC, where he created the first WYSIWYG text editor called Bravo. He's probably best known for his work at Microsoft, where he is the chief architect of Microsoft Word, Excel, and other popular application programs. So please give a very warm welcome to Charles. Wonderful to have you here. So great to have you here. So as I mentioned, Alan Kay will be joining via video recording. We'd also like to give a special recognition to one more core member of the original Alto team, Charles Thacker. He passed away in 2017. Here at CHM in 2007, we were very proud to present him with our Fellow Award for leading development of the Xerox PARC Alto and for innovations in networked personal computer systems and laser printing technologies. Please also join me in giving a round of applause in memory of Charles. Here to moderate the panel is John Schock. He first joined Xerox PARC while an undergrad at Stanford, and then from 1982 to 85, he was served as president of the Office Systems division at Xerox, helping to launch products developed at PARC. He's been a computer scientist, a venture capitalist, an executive, and for many years, very special that he served as trustee here at CHM. Let's join John Schock.
Thank you, Marguerite. That was great. Thank you, everyone. Let's plunge right in. We're here to celebrate 50 years since the Alto, but it's not just a piece of history, because we have a recent, what they say in the journalism business, a news hook or a news peg, is that some of you may have read that just yesterday, Xerox decided to transfer all of PARC to SRI. An interesting milestone in the evolution of computer research. It will bookend, I hope, a little bit our discussion about the specifics of the Alto, about what it takes to develop something like the Alto and the prospects for computer research. Just to get calibrated a little bit, let me just ask, even in the dark, how many people, so we're celebrating the Alto 50 years old, how many people here weren't born when the Alto was done? Okay. How many people here have touched and worked on an Alto keyboard at some point in their life? Okay. And how many people here, even a smaller group, had an email account on Macs? Okay, we got a couple old timers, but we have a bunch of new people, so we will try to span this audience. I'm not sure how successful we'll be, but we will plunge on.
I still know the password for Macs.
There we go.
3301.
When we talk about the Alto, my friends at the Computer History Museum warn me regularly not to try to use the word first, that you have to have too many qualifiers and adjectives, and too many people want to fight about it. But with respect to the Alto, I've chosen to just defer to the ACM in their Turing Award citation for Chuck Thacker, which describes it as the first modern personal computer. Modern is a little ambiguous, but David Brock, as well, of the CHM, in a recent article in the IEEE Spectrum wrote, "We are now living in a world of computing that the Alto created. Standalone machines, as you saw, the mouse, bitmap display, Windows, combined with local networking servers, internetworking." And I always think that to put this in context, if you had used the Alto in 1973 and you were Rip Van Winkle and you went to sleep for 50 years and you woke up today in front of a PC or a Mac, you could probably work most of it okay. And compare that to those of us who were in 1973 with the Alto. If we had sat in a room and tried to figure out what was it that our ancestors used 50 years ago, that would have been a Hollerith hand-punched card. So the impact and the endurance for the 50 years from 1973 is impressive. Let me commend to you, we're only going to touch upon this a little bit, some other things that people might look at, particularly videos. In January 1986, the History of Personal Workstations Conference, there's a video of this with both Butler and Chuck Thacker. I will note that the history conference about the Alto was 37 years ago. In June of 2001, the Xerox Alto, a personal retrospective, is a recording there's a video of Butler and Chuck talking about this. That's 22 years ago. And in 2017, with the help of many people, including Charles, who's here again today, we were able to put on, with the help of the CHM and others, a live demo of an Alto working, and we now have the machines being emulated downstairs. That alone was 6 years ago. So 50 years, quite an impact. We're blessed to have two of the principals here on the panel live. We're going to hear some pre-recorded comments from Alan, and we will try to weave a conversation around those. And so the first part here, what I'd like to say is, to understand the emergence of the Alto, it's important to understand the context of a machine called Max, and before that, the formation of Xerox PARC, particularly the computer science lab. And so, Butler, I wonder if you might take just a few minutes to set the stage here a little bit, pre-Alto, pre-PARC, of the paradigm for computing, time sharing, UC Berkeley, BCC, to do a little context before we get to PARC.
Well, I recently retired from Microsoft, and my manager, in giving her retirement spiel, said she was looking back at my career, and there was a big discontinuity between the work I'd done on time sharing in the 60s and the work at PARC on the Alto. But I didn't think of it that way at all, and I still don't. We were doing interactive computing. Time sharing was just the only way we could figure out how to do interactive computing reasonably economically in the 1960s. But it wasn't what we wanted. So from that point of view, the Alto was just a no-brainer. The only question was, could you make something like the Alto? If you could, then of course you would want it.
Charles, do you want to say a little bit about the context and what you were doing before you got to Xerox?
Right. I mean, basically the only reason that I'm sitting here on the podium is because of my friendship with Butler and Chuck Thacker. And before, and this is predating predating the Alto times. And I actually wasn't involved much in the Alto hardware. However, Alto had important predecessors, and I think that the grandfather of Alto, I think, is the BCC 500. And I'm talking now about the architecture and the technology. The father of Alto is the Max, arguably. And these three eras I would describe as hubris, which was BCC 500, and I'd like to, Butler maybe agree or disagree with that.
The classic second system, no question about it.
Okay, so hubris. And then the father is, I think, I would say humility, and I will have some stories about it
Great.
And it's really Chuck coming back to the basics and really understanding how to create a working computer efficiently. And then, of course, humility is one of those things that you can have too much of. And so you want to set higher goals, and that's where the Alto comes, which I call synthesis.
Great.
And that's where, I think that Butler, in my many years, we were just talking about Donald Knuth today in the context of this IBM 650, that apparently Don is quoted that he spent many pleasurable nights with. And I have to say that I have spent many very pleasant nights with Butler and with Chuck working on the BCC 500. I'm not sure why we were working at night, but there were explanations.
The reason we were working at night was that we had to have a time sharing system to build the BCC 500, and the only one we could only get at night, because other people were using it during the day.
More important people were using it today. Anyway,
People who owned it were using it during the day.
So the context here in the late 60s, the evolution from mainframe computing to time-shared computing, larger machines, interactive to some extent. And then we arrive in 69 and 70. Xerox decides to get in the computer business. They decide to buy SDS, a whole nother subject by itself. A guy named Jack Goldman runs research, decides to do a lab to cover, amongst other things, computing and system sciences. He hires a guy named George Paik, who had been provost at Washington University in St. Louis. And George, in trying to figure out how to staff the lab, recruits Bob Taylor, who had been at ARPA handing out money to ARPA sites at universities and getting to know the principal investigators and many of the graduate students. And he had the job starting in 1970, of recruiting people, including those from BCC, which is why I tried to lay the context. And here's Alan Kay talking about this experience.
Xerox wound up hiring Bob Taylor, who had been one of the ARPA funders in Washington, to set up the lab at PARC. And of course, he knew all of these grad students that he'd funded. And he decided he basically wanted a young lab. So he generally hired young people to be researchers there, and for the people more his age and older, he used them as consultants and kind of give us advice every once in a while. But Taylor had very strong ideas of how PARC should be set up, and he went after the kind of people he wanted. And he especially wanted people who had already bought into this idea of Licklighters, of what the destiny of computers should be about. And this group included people like Butler Lamson and Chuck Thacker and Ed Fiala and Peter Deutsch and Dick Schaup. Taylor's idea was, you want to work with good people. And one of the ways of maximizing the synergy is to recognize what things people are really great at and what things they're more ordinary at. And Taylor was really great at understanding how to run a group of people doing far out research. But he was not a computer scientist at all. But he had an overview. And he also had notions of methods. For instance, somebody once asked him, well, what do you do, Bob? Bob said, well, what we have here is an organization of the best people I can find in the world. Many of them are lone wolves. That's how they got where they are. And my job is to set up the culture here at PARC so that when these lone wolves need to cooperate with each other, they will.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you.
So 1970, Bob Taylor joins. In 71, I think, is when the BCC group arrives. I arrive in the summer, so I'm a little later. I actually looked at the badge numbers, and I think Thacker arrived first, about 10 people before you, and I was about 10 people later. But Butler, so we're in the early formation of PARC. Taylor is there, this early group is there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, the dynamics, Taylor's management style, the decisions, how you ended up at Max, how the research program unfolded during this very early period. And then, of course, leads to the Alto.
Well, the prevailing way of doing computing research in the early 70s was on a DEC PDP-10. So the obvious thing for us to do was to buy a PDP-10, but that was not possible because DEC was XDS's biggest competitor. So it wasn't clear that we would be absolutely prevented from buying a PDP-10. But it was clear that if we did that, our name would be mud in a large part of the corporation from then on. So we decided that was not a good deal. And instead of buying a PDP-10, we would build one. Which at first seems kind of crazy. And several people told us that it was crazy. But then we did what we thought was a pretty realistic estimate of the cost of duplicating all the existing research-relevant software that existed for the PDP-10 on some other machine, for example, an XDS Sigma 7. And that was way more expensive. So, and whereas building a PDP-10 was a comparatively straightforward task, which we carried out quite successfully. I think the scariest moment on it was when an obscure bug showed up when you ran the disk, the effect of which was to crash the operating system. And Charles was in charge of the microcode and very successfully tracked down the bug, which was a bug of mine. When we took the microinterrupts for the disk, I failed to save, I think it was the carry bit, wasn't it?
I think you are thinking of somebody else, but I was doing the 10x size, but 10x size.
You tracked down this bug.
Well, that could be.
Take the credit for it, Charles.
Okay.
There are some technical antecedents, microcode memory. Do you want to say a few words about what you learned on Max, which then led to, that contributed to the Alto?
I mean, you were pointing out what led to the necessity of doing this semi-crazy stunt. But in fact, it was so fortuitous because a lot was learned from Max. And I remember Chuck, he was a consummate engineer. He was an engineer's engineer, fantastic, clear-thinking person. And he was showing me the first steps toward Max, and in particular, all the crazy stuff that we did on BCC 500 from the hardware point of view. The crazy stuff from the software point of view, we're not going to repeat that. But from a hardware point of view, he discovered wire wrapping, for example. And he came with showing me this fantastic little tool that you undo a wire wrap with. It looks like a little pen, and you twist it, and then the wire wrap comes up, and then you have a little gun. I'm not sure if it was air-driven or battery-driven. I don't think it worked at the time. Do a wire wrap, and that was, and then he was showing me the little connectors. That was when the RJ11 connectors just came into being. He was in seventh heaven because he had all the money he needed for two reasons. One of them is that PARC was fairly well financed, but also that the goals were much more modest. So relative to the goals and relative to the environment, it was just wonderful for him. And I think that without that experience of how to do a reliable computer at a reasonable price, and you might think that $50,000 is not reasonable, but it could have been easily $100,000, and it could have been easily 2 years or 3 years of development. But I think Max made it possible, and Chuck did the hardware for that.
So I think what Chuck did with the Alto, typically, if you look at the way big changes happen in computing, they're gated by hardware. So the Alto is a classic example. All this interactive computing was gated by the Alto hardware, and in particular by Chuck's brilliant insight that memory had gotten cheap enough that you could afford to give up 500,000 bits of it to paint the screen. The most recent illustration of this is deep learning, which was also enabled by hardware advance. And I think it's pretty consistently been true during the whole evolution of computing, that it's gated by hardware advances. Typically, when the advances occur, people don't appreciate what their impact is going to be. It takes, because of course it takes software to exploit the hardware advances. But you can never get anyone to write the software until the hardware exists.
So we have in this environment Max with microprogramming the earliest. I guess 1103 was not quite technically the first. There was an 1101, I think, that didn't work very well. 1103, 1 kilobit chip, worked into semiconductor memory for Macs.
Let me add the
yeah.
EEPROM. I think the EEPROM was pretty important.
Yes.
With the BCC 500 used actually a discrete diode for every 1 bit in the memory.
Yeah.
So we had these cards full of diodes at particular places, and to edit the microcode, we either clipped a diode that was there to create a 0, or we drilled a hole and soldered in the new diode. And of course, we had lots of cold solder joints.
Right.
That's why that's why Chuck was so happy about the wire wrap.
Wire wrap, yeah.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a cold wire wrap.
So we've arrived at the moment in 72 against this context where the Alto becomes, realistic in people's views, and maybe we could tee up the second video of Alan talking about this.
Why was ARPA so successful? Why was PARC so successful compared to everything else that was going on? Well, the researchers at PARC were homed in on a very large set of ideas from the larger and earlier ARPA community. Most of us were members of that community as students, some as professors. And the aim of the ARPA community, as expressed by Licklider, JCR Licklider, who set it up, was he had a sense that the destiny of computers was to become personal intellectual amplifiers spread over the entire Earth, pervasively networked to everybody. And of course, in those days, one of the larger thoughts about networking was it would be what we call the cloud today. That was always in the plan. It goes back to the 50s. The reason you have a computer in the first place, especially a personal computer, was to make something sufficiently powerful that Moore's law would catch up to it in 15 years. And that the stuff that we worked out, because we had this machine, would actually be relevant when it became cheap enough to put into commercial play. The Alto was you could think of it as the approach to it was to make a moldable computer, a computer within a computer, where the inner computer was so much faster than main memory that you could program it to imitate a conventionally made computer, and you wouldn't lose anything. It was a key thing because it allowed everybody at PARC who was interested, for instance, in doing a programming language, to know that they could make a custom inner machine out of software in the microcode that would run their experimental programming language in a reasonable way. That was critical. The Alto was not an attempt to make a computer of the future, but to make a computer in the present that could do what a future computer could do.
So Butler, we're at the moment where Alan has an ideas, pivoting off of Licklider and others. You've come out off of Max. Chuck, has his objectives. You want to say a little bit about how you all came together to propose the Alto, fund it, and the story that goes with that?
Well, I think there are only really two parts to that story. Chuck had this brilliant insight, and it didn't take a lot of extrapolation just to see what opportunities would be opened up if you actually had a machine with a 8.5 by 11 page that you could write anything you wanted on. I'm overstating the wonderfulness of it somewhat, but not too much. And we could pretty easily see how you would network it, although that required a lot of work, and the development of Ethernet is a whole story on its own. So it wasn't hard to see how great this was going to be. And then Alan had a fair amount of money allocated, which he couldn't find any sensible way to spend. because the things that were available were just so inadequate for what he wanted to do. But the Alto, as he just said in the recent spiel, was pretty suitable for what he wanted to do. So that was good. Alan paid for a fair number of the Altos, initial Altos that got built. And once the Alto came into existence, it became an object of desire. If you saw one, you had to have it. And so the result was several stages of refinement of the engineering and construction of more and more Altos. And people would work hard to find the money in their budget for them. And originally we said they would cost $10,000. Actually, I think they came out costing closer to $20,000, which is about $100,000 in today's money. So they were not cheap machines, but as Alan said, they were time machines. They allowed us to do now, to get people to actually design systems and write programs for the machines that would be ubiquitous 15 years in the future. And that's exactly the way it played out.
One of the things Butler passed over the bitmap display, I mean, we sort of forget the whole generation of graphics before that most people don't remember. The IMLAC with vector drawing, and if the image, and so in real time it's moving in X, Y, and Z with a single electron beam, and if your image is too complicated, it runs out of time and you start to get flicker, and this is what was good graphics at the time. And the notion—
the last line of my Why Alto memo was, IMLACs are wiped out.
Right. IMLACs got wiped out by the bitmap display. And I'd have to go back. We had Don Bitzer here some time ago, and I think they had just started the plasma panel. And the reason the plasma panel was magic, it was a display, but the display bits had their own memory and storage. So you could write something to this display, and you didn't need to have a bunch of core or semiconductor memory to back it up. And this was an incredible advance at the time, except they were orange and the resolution wasn't very good. And so what it took to say, oh yeah, I'm going to take half of the machine to do a bitmap, which we take for granted today, and it's a few chips in some machine, and this was sort of a, oh my God, can we actually do this? Now, Chuck, in commenting on the Alto, has observed a number of times in some of these videos, which people can go see, that an Alto with no software is just a hot rock. And a computer that can't do anything isn't very interesting. Charles, you and Butler and others were responsible for some of the most important software applications written for the Alto. I wonder if you want to say a little bit about Bravo and anything else sort of on the software side of the underlying hardware.
Well, before that, I'd like to just acknowledge how special the Alto was from a software perspective. I've been talking hardware before this, basically because of my connection with Chuck, but I'm a software engineer, and Butler is absolutely right. When you saw the concept, it was obvious that this is going to be big, and it's something that you would want. And I was among the lucky people who got one that went under my desk. It's a perfect machine. It's so generous, and at the same time it's so simple. It's like the perfect digital artifact where bits are coming in from the keyboard. The keyboard didn't read characters. The keyboard was reading bits of which key was down. The mouse, it didn't give you coordinates. It gave you bits of what wheels are moving. And on the output, you didn't interface with a 3270 fantastic display. You put bits down. And by the way, I think the plasma died because it was difficult to read it. It might have remembered what you put in there, but in order to move pictures and
you had to erase them.
Things. So when you are trying to go cheap, you lose. So you really have to, and this is a time machine. And what Alan was saying also, I mean, remember that it's the grandfather he was talking about the benefit of microcoding.
Right.
And the grandfather of Alto, that's where the genes came from for that fantastic aspect. But back to the software, it's, I was, by that time I was actually working at Xerox. Before I was just doing quarter time. And I walked by Butler's office one day, and he had 3 pages of notes on his desk. And I asked him what they were, and he said, oh, well, we need an editor for the Alto, obviously, a text editor for programming, and maybe for something more, perhaps. And I got very excited about it, and that's where Bravo started in several steps. First version was in 74 September, and then other people, Tesla and Mott, picked up the code and created Gypsy, which was kind of a Gypsy that leaves the base somehow, the Bravo base, and then you are going on the side. So that was Gypsy, and we learned a lot from that experience, and that's when we put formatting into Bravo. And then, of course, the laser printer came along, and from then on, we can talk about it, about the impact was tremendous, because that was probably the first time that people other than the priests, us, the technical people, actually used computers for their own purpose and did their own work. And we have many stories about that. Hope we'll have time for that.
Badr, do you want anything more about the software side of the Alto or applications?
Well, I wrote a paper about the Alto software in the history of personal workstations conference, which was in what, 1985, 86, something like that. You can find it on the web, and it goes into a fair amount of detail about how we manage the software evolution and the various different components of it, the fonts and the graphics programs and the drawing programs and the circuit design programs, as well as Bravo and the networking and maybe some other things that have slipped my mind. It was a fairly large suite of software, and it was built under very severe constraints because the Alto only had a megabit of memory. That's 128 kilobytes. And if you wanted a full screen display, that took half, which was too much for most applications. Did not have full screen displays for that reason. And in fact, Bravo was the most aggressive in this respect. Bravo allocated a separate little strip of memory for each line of the document. And when the editing needed more memory, it would take away the memory from the display, so the visible part of the document would get smaller and smaller until finally it got to be only half a dozen lines, and then you couldn't really work anymore. Then you had to write your document out and start over. Do a giant reset.
It's a good practice anyway, to save your work.
No, it was actually a great experience. You'd be doing something and you'd ask it, I don't know, to print or format or do something. Yeah. And you'd be sitting there and you'd watch the bottom lines of your text disappear as they were being absorbed into the memory to execute. And all you hoped was that the program could finish before it completely ran out of memory. And then it would refresh the page. But you had this brief moment where you thought, oh my God, the whole chapter of my thesis is gone. It just got deleted. What happened here? And it would come back, and it was all a miracle. And I wonder if the two you might elaborate a little bit.
Sorry, I wanted to finish that paragraph.
Please. Oh, I'm sorry.
Look, I didn't give you any clue that there was more, but there was. Yeah. The consequence of this was that Alto software had to be developed as a bunch of completely separate applications that were only connected to each other through the file system. And many people chafed at this and felt that, why couldn't I build an application that used the Bravo formatting stuff and also did other things, as we expect should happen today. But that was just not possible in the Alto. And there were several efforts to get around this, except for Smalltalk, they all failed. And Smalltalk bit the bullet and said, we're going to sacrifice performance in favor of a full screen display and the ability to write larger applications. And that was extremely successful for doing experiments. It was not any good for doing everyday work because it was too slow. But it worked out very well that the Smalltalk guys were able to pursue that line of work. And the other Alto applications had to live with this constraint that they had to be standalone.
I think this is so pragmatic, and I think that the pragmatic idea was super important for the success of the different programs.
Yeah, and this is I guess the single thing that I'm proudest of, that I fought back all the efforts to make a more integrated and collaborative environment.
Good. Let's move ahead a little bit, on the broader. We're going to be out of time here shortly. It's great to tell these stories, to relive them, to understand, and we're not in a place to go through the history of all the machines and the Sun workstations and others that were really direct derivatives of this. But there is a broader question about the culture and the environment and the funding of how do you do open-ended computer science systems research. And we have a third clip from Alan with his view on this.
My one-liner about ARPA and PARC is the goodness of the results correlated most strongly with the goodness of the funders. And there have never been any funders as good as the ARPA funders and through Taylor at PARC since then. So we're basically looking at something that has hung on for good or ill for 50 years now. And that, to me, indicates that not a lot of things that could have been done got done. And that is not because of lack of smart people, but it's because of lack of funders who know how to fund. So what we've got going now is commercial interests are basically looking at the simplest way to predict the future, and their future involves monetization of mass humanity. And so there's a lot of things that could be done now. I mean, we would kill for 1 square inch, just one, or 1 cubic centimeter of an iPhone. It's thousands of times faster than the Alto was. You can emulate the Alto using JavaScript in a browser, and it's thousands of times faster. I mean, but all this computing power is not being used to be directed at any of the ideals that the original founders of ARPA had hoped for. Engelbart's idea that anytime you make something of power, like a hammer or an atomic weapon, if you just give the thing of power to the normal practical human being, they will become a hammerer, but the hammer doesn't teach you to be a wise hammerer. So you might use the hammer on your baby sister if you get angry. So Engelbart's idea is that anytime you create power, you have to insert training and education in between it. And it has to be an integral part of the power. And there needs to be an understanding of the ramifications of the power, even as you want to use these things. I'm alive today with my cancer precisely because of some of this technology we invented 50 years ago.
So I've always said we were blessed to have an opportunity in a research center with funding and management and a pretty open agenda. I'm curious as to whether you share Alan's point of view. Now, both of you have gone on to work in one case at one and in one case at 2 different major corporations in their research organizations. Has PARC been replicated? Was it replicated through these years? Can it be replicated? Or is it really sui generis? I'm not sure if you think it's that unique.
I'm not sure if, I'm pretty happy with the progress that has been made since, and actually quite proud. We have a number of people here from Microsoft Research. Rick Rashid is here, and people from Google. I'm not sure if the success of PARC of course, it had, I mean, the personalities are amazing. You know, Chuck Decker and Butler and Bob Taylor, especially. By the way, Alan mentioned that he wasn't a computer scientist, he was a psychologist. And I think that made a lot of difference. I think that maybe it was a special time and place in technology, more than in the people who were there. It was those ideas were ripe, and I think we were very lucky to be there and
Right.
exploit those ideas.
Luck was very important.
Butler, you want to add any final words on this?
Well, I've been reflecting for a long time on the fact that today's PCs are approximately 100,000 times or more capable than the Alto in every significant dimension: computing power, storage, network bandwidth, across the board. And they do, what, maybe 100 times as much, maybe at a stretch they do 1,000 times as much. So that still leaves a factor of 100 unaccounted for. Where did it go?
I think I agree with you. I agree with you. I have the same feeling all the time, and the best I can say is that it went into time compression. I think that we can produce software so much faster and so much alacrity and so much variation and you know, finding out what works and what doesn't work. And of course, the biggest thing, AI.
Right. And we're going to hear more about that in a moment. Butler, Charles, thank you both. In the tradition of the CHM, we end with a final farewell, one word from each of you. And I think, Butler, you might have one perhaps here.
They said it would be on this side.
Oh, well, we're just here to fool you.
All right. So Dick Hamming famously said, "The purpose of computing is insight, not numbers." And then supposedly 10 years later, he said, "The purpose of computing is not yet insight."
I don't know, I was forced to do this, but I sometimes talk to young people, and they always, you know, one of the questions that you always get is what's your advice for future and careers and life and the universe and all that. And instead of saying 42, I say prepare, and of course they say prepare for what? And I say, well, you don't know what the future brings. Prepare for everything. And so you know, learn languages, read the encyclopedia, and when you finish reading it, read it again, and different versions.
Great. Thank you both very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Butler.
Thank you, Martin.
What amazing
That was great, Charles.
Thank you. Thanks for your
conversation. Thank you very much, too. Well, now we're going to fast forward to today. As we think about inventing the future, this next panel, we're going to look at revolutionary changes that are underway today in the world of computing. So everyday machine learning and AI, as they were just mentioned, are center stage in the public spotlight. There are stories that are positive. There's stories about the perils. Perhaps similar to other inflection points in computing history, we can see a lot of momentum and change, and the way forward may seem uncertain. A recently released report by the Stanford Center of Human-Centered AI showed the dramatic increase in significant machine learning systems over the past decade. Incredible, right? And you can see that the locus of activity has shifted to industry, 32. More than 10 times significant machine learning systems have been deployed in industry compared to, 3 in academia last year. This report also found that AI research publications are on the rise across the board. The number of AI publications on subjects such as pattern recognition, machine learning, and computer vision have more than doubled in just 5 years. At the same time, AI is more widely applied. Concerns about the misuse are rapidly rising. There are calls for new kinds of controls, possibly policy and regulations. With all this in mind, we're excited to welcome for our next panel 2 computer scientists who are literally pioneering research labs to discuss their views on the momentous advancements that they're helping lead, where they see it going, and what might be on the horizon. So, as is our tradition, here are our next speaker's 5 numbers. First up, Ilya Sutskever. 2012, co-published AlexNet, 3 years on the Google Brain team, 7 years at OpenAI, 20 years working on AI, and 4 GPTs. He's co-founder and chief scientist at OpenAI, which aims to build artificial general intelligence that benefits all of humanity. He leads research at OpenAI and is one of the architects behind the GPT models. Prior to OpenAI, he was co-inventor of AlexNet and sequence-to-sequence learning. Please welcome Ilya Sutskever. Next, Ora Korovets. 3,510 numbers of transistors in the first microprocessor programmed. It was a 6502, by the way, in 1984. $1.50 was the stock price when he started at Microsoft. 1998 was the year he developed his first ML-powered email spam detector. 102, number of interns mentored at Microsoft so far. And 1,050 kilohertz was the radio frequency celebrated at birth. There's a story behind that. So he's chief scientific officer at Microsoft, where his research centers on challenges with uses of AI. And he's a member of the President's Council of Advisors. We're so glad to have you here, Eric. Welcome. And here to moderate our conversation is Diane Sylvain. She's a professor of computer science and adjunct professor of mathematics at Tufts. She was appointed to the National Science Board in 2008 and served as its chair for 4 years until 2020. She currently serves on our own board of trustees here at CHM. Please welcome Diane.
So thank you, Ilya and Eric, for joining us for this conversation about research. We want to divide our conversation into 2 parts. We'd like to start by talking about connecting Alto's legacy to your current research that's on the edge. But to kick it off, I'd like to turn to Eric first and ask you, how did the Alto affect you personally?
The Alto actually had a deep effect on me. I walked into an office, a computing room at Margaret Jacks Hall in the early 80s. I was just coming in to Stanford from doing a biophysics undergraduate degree, focusing on neurobiology. And I was stunned at seeing something that I thought, as a mainframe programmer at the time, was delivered from the future. That artifact led me to really pursue, like, who was the team behind this? What was the research story? And that brought me, we've heard the name JCR, Joseph Licklider today. Before Licklider, Vannevar Bush. After Licklider, Doug Engelbart. It really set me up, and it framed the research I came to do, which intentionally focused on Licklider's dream of pursuing human-computer symbiosis, as he called it, doing that well.
That's great. So now, for both of you, how are your organization's current cultures and environments, how are they framed, and how does that maybe compare to PARC?
Well, it's a bit hard to compare to PARC, to compare our organization, OpenAI, to PARC, because to the best of my knowledge, PARC was facing quite a different problem, and they had a different, maybe I'll put it this way. In every point in time, as technology advances, the kinds of problems that show up and the kinds of approaches that are necessary to solve them and the cultures that support them change with time. My sense is that in PARC, the goal was to figure out what to do with these computers from the future. So you had all these great researchers who tried to do interesting things with those computers. And they discovered new ways to use those computers that no one could have imagined before them. At OpenAI, the situation is different. The situation has been different because, well, maybe to add additional context, OpenAI has been around for 7 years now. So it's not a very old organization, but it's also not a very new organization either. The culture of OpenAI has changed over time as we got more and more clarity about how to make progress. In the first year, our culture was a little bit more exploratory. We were trying to understand what it is that we want to do and hone in on the big ideas that we wanted to pursue. And then as time went on, our culture started to adopt more aspects of large-scale engineering projects. Because our goal is not just to invent something, our goal is also to build it. And building requires a really strong engineering culture, where large teams are working together to produce sophisticated engineering artifacts. And probably that would be the biggest difference from PARC, if I had to make a guess.
Thank you. So Eric, what would you say?
So most of my time at Microsoft has been spent at Microsoft Research. It's delightful to see Rick Rashid here tonight, who founded Microsoft Research. 2 years ago, I moved into becoming Chief Scientific Officer after serving as director of Microsoft Research for a number of years, and before that, the director of our lab on the main campus at Microsoft. In my current role as Chief Scientific Officer, I lead what's called the Applied Research Council, because over the years, while Microsoft Research was in many ways in 1991 when it was formed, maybe the only deep research team at Microsoft. Over the years, we saw teams, HoloLens, for example, our search teams, cloud research, growing across campus. So now we have kind of a nexus that we actually coordinate through something called the Applied Research Council, which is very interesting for me to co-chair. But Microsoft Research, Rick, I think, had it right when he put as the first mission, part of the mission statement, advance the state of the art. There was no mention of Microsoft in that statement. And that was taken to heart in thinking out of the box. In fact, I don't know if Rick's here tonight, but he remembers in my first year at Microsoft Research, I just come up from Stanford, and I was really excited about many, many things, including shipping stuff, changing the world through Microsoft's current applications and services. And at my first review with Rick, he said to me, it's all very exciting, Eric, what you're doing with all these product teams, and I'm sure they're very thankful, but are you sure you're spending your time in the right place? And the fact that the lead at the time, and I inherited this spirit when I worked with people when I came into a senior role, was to really think deeply and unleash creative powers, along with that notion of thinking out of the box and not really being constrained by current products or current understandings, was this idea of openness. So one of the deepest principle at Microsoft Research was there are no controls on publications or your interactions with the researchers in the open world. This is reminiscent of hearing Alan Kay talk about the ARPA community. Because we're all part of a very large community. Even at a company like Microsoft, we're connected deeply with other companies, with universities. And having that community being part of our thinking process was always very, very important. This idea of an open research lab in many, many ways. And so I think the openness, the creativity being pushed, the thinking out of the box. One of the ways I would justify some of the things that we were doing in recent years was very Alto-like. Create something that's magical and way out there. It's way from the future. And you want to talk to Microsoft folks about it, bring it back, pull it from the frontier into the present, and then we'll work on the bridge.
Okay. So we're going to think way outside the box and think of where we sit today. what do each of you see as the most important, or maybe the most audacious goals for computing now, and why?
I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. I think all of computing has just one goal right now, which is to actually build artificial intelligence which loves humanity, or some variant thereof.
So, okay, do you have a sense of, in the spirit of that goal, then, how do you spur people to think broadly about what is serving humanity, or what is possible?
Well, the thing to note is that, so for a little bit of context, all the AI that exists today is based on top of deep learning, which is a relatively narrow set of ideas compared to the broader computer science. So in the past 5 years or 7 years or so, there's been, or maybe more, 10 years, there's been this contraction where previously there's been lots of activity all over in computer science research, and now it's all concentrated in AI on deep learning specifically. So people go really deep, and people understand those techniques, deep learning, which is basically ways of building digital brains which live inside large computers. That's what deep learning is. Literally, we build digital brains with artificial neurons inside big computers. And there's a certain set of ideas that come with it. There are certain ways of thinking which are more forward-looking. And when people work together and they internalize these forward-looking ideas, like, very substantial and productive progress is possible.
Thank you.
Let me resonate deeply with Ilya's comments just now. By the way, I'm sure we both remember a meeting maybe 4 or 5 years ago, an early Microsoft OpenAI meeting in a conference room, where at some point in time, Ilya got up to the whiteboard and he drew the plan for general artificial intelligence. And we just sat there with our mouths open because, you know, I brought with me a set of serious, quote unquote, Microsoft researchers who were like, okay, can you draw that again? Can you show me what that piece means? And, you know, Ilya, you see him right here. I mean, he's very serious. He said, here's what we're going to do. Let me just mention, I mentioned earlier that I came to Stanford with, you know, from undergraduate training in biophysics with a focus on neurobiology. I spent 2 years in darkened laboratories looking at oscilloscopes, what neurons were doing in small animals, trying to figure out like how this relates to thinking, to human minds, to the foundations of intellect. Of course, there's a big gap there. And I decided in heading to Stanford that the fastest way to get insights about what might be going on in our own minds was through computation. I made that call. So for me, the audacious goal in computing today is to understand deeply, for humanity to understand deeply the foundations of mind, of human intellect. And many things will come of that, of course. Now, I think that Ilya and I are very much aligned on that right now. Let me just mention a couple of shorter-term goals, briefly. I think, and this gets back to comments we heard earlier about from Butler and Alan Kay, what's going on with the other 1,000 orders of magnitude, or was it 100? And let me just say that I would love for everybody in this room, if you haven't done so yet, to read through Vannevar Bush's vision, as we may think, and J.C.R. Licklider's vision of human-machine symbiosis. We're nowhere near the vision that those ARPA funders were so excited about and why the lab, why PARC existed. I've made this part of my research agenda. It's a chunk of it over the years. But think about this. Computing systems should be reasoning about how to complement people in a deep way. They should understand our thinking processes, understand the gaps in our reasoning, how to best complement us in whether it be creativity or logical reasoning or synthesis, abstraction. If you read the beautiful writings of Licklider, and he was also a psychologist, by the way, interested in computing. The very moment he saw his first interactive computer, from my understanding, which was the Whirlwind machine, he had this gigantic vision, like, these machines someday would be scientific apprentices. They would be doing the work to help human scientists understand and extend their thinking in ways that you could only do if you understand human thinking. So I see that as a near-term audacious goal, to really continue on and push on the vision that Licklider laid down. That's the vision behind the Alto, which is part of the way there. And it was a big jump at the time. And then I'll just also mention a third goal, and I think Ilya and I would agree with this also. Even today, we're seeing incredible opportunities to apply various forms of AI, not just deep learning, but of course the advances of deep learning are really impressive for the biosciences and healthcare in particular. I think we're going to see huge transformation of medicine, and we're going to see an incredible acceleration in bioscience over the next decade.
So that ties very well into the next question. I have a three-part question about the future. First, what do you hope will happen?
So what I hope will happen is that as the field keeps on making progress and artificial intelligence gets smarter and smarter, it is eventually built and it's used to solve a huge number of problems that society has. A lot of problems that have been intractable for a long time around, from small things like global warming to international relationships to massive scale, mega cheap autonomous healthcare to curing lots of diseases and extending life and living on other planets. I think all of this could happen. It'd be rather nice.
Okay.
We're very much aligned. Look, it's clear, I think, to everybody in this room, especially given the recent developments, many thanks to the work that Ilya has been leading, that AI will be in various forms, but largely, I think, expanding out now from the deep learning research program and expanding beyond that, calling back to other aspects of AI as well, will be extremely disruptive to humanity. Now, disruption is not a bad thing, but it raises our anxieties and makes us apprehensive. What I'm hoping for is that it all goes well. And we're reading, we all know the touch points, the influence of AI on jobs in the economy, how these systems will affect our education and our sense for what we do in life, what we spend our time doing, our sense for the uniqueness of our identity as humanity when it comes to, for the first time in history, intellects that are kind of at the level, in many ways, that we had thought was a unique aspect of what it was to be human on Earth. So I think with guidance, and it will go well. And one comment I'll make is, I've never seen, I don't think in history we've had so much deliberation and reflection across sectors, the governments, private sector, civil society, thinking deeply and proactively to help and hopefully come together to assure that things will go pretty well.
So your answer leads into both of the other parts of the question. You've mapped things out in a good way. A part we want to think about briefly maybe is, what do you fear will happen or might happen?
Yeah, so I can talk about what it is that I do not want to happen.
Right.
In a nutshell, AI is going to be incredibly, unbelievably powerful, incredibly, unbelievably impactful. And with such tremendous power, comes the possibility that perhaps things won't go quite the way we want. Will we be able to manage such powerful tools, and also the technical challenges of making those technical tools well behaved? I think these are all very significant risks. And it is my wish that basically none of this happens.
Well said.
So I think that many things can go awry, and there are limitations and rough edges in these systems. One of my primary concerns with the advances in AI, and I love what Alan Kay said about what Doug Engelbart had said about what you do when you come upon new powers through technology. You need to really think deeply about education, guardrails, and a certain piece of that R&D pie chart and policy thinking has to really be has to go into thinking about how to best harness these technologies for the best, while thinking deeply about how to minimize potential costs and rough edges. I'm deeply concerned about these technologies being in the hands of malevolent actors, whether they be nation states competing with the United States, for example, or other teams or groups of bad actors. One of my fears is that without proper policy and technical guardrails, we could be entering a post-epistemic world where nobody knows what's going on because of the powers of these systems to manipulate, to synthesize, to create alternative realities, and to make them as real as the reality that we might see with our own senses in the open world. I'm hopeful that methods being explored now, both in the technology and the policy and legal space, will help us stay ahead of that possible future.
Mm-hmm. So Ilya, do you also see any need for guardrails, or do you have a sense of what guardrails you might want to see put in place to prevent the things that you don't want to happen?
I mean, totally. I would say when it comes to guardrails, there are many layers of guardrails that one could place. Mm-hmm. And I'll describe some of them. There are the guardrails that are placed by those who are developing the technology, which is we want that technology, we want it to not misbehave, we want it to refuse unacceptable requests. Mm-hmm. There are good arguments being made, and that's something that's being done, where the most powerful systems are put behind, are held on a server behind an API. I do expect that we will also want to see guardrails at a societal level as well. We will want to see rules that are being, well-chosen, wise rules, a tall order, not an easy thing to do. But they can help. They can help all the companies and all the efforts that are working on such technology to make collective choices that will lead to a better environment outcome for everyone. Perhaps I would, yeah.
You know, I'd like to comment, this might interest this group, that the GPT-4 model, and maybe you can add to this, Ilya, when we'll refer to it as GPT-4 base, became available, and our teams at Microsoft also were looking at this very carefully. My sense was immediately after playing with it, of course it was delightful given all that it could do, was this is unsafe to be out in the world raw. And you could generate many examples of this. But the technical work and the amount of investment that had to go in to go from the base to GPT-4 that became public in early March was extensive. There were, and OpenAI did their thing, Microsoft did its thing, and there was coordination. But several distinct work streams with metrics measuring things one would be concerned about. For example, the ability of the system to manipulate people, the challenge of these systems with hallucination, the ability of these systems to generate toxic speech or to stereotype. What I would hope we see in the future is these techniques, which haven't been broadcast widely and shared widely enough, become more transparently available to the world, to computer scientists more broadly, and we all work as larger communities on these methods. Because there actually is hope, and lots of progress was made even in the early days of GPT-4. Or if you have comment on this too, Ilya.
I do, yes. So, at the current paradigm, the kinds of systems that are being deployed, I'll elaborate a bit on Eric's comment. There is an extensive pre-training run where the neural network learns everything it can learn about the world and tries to understand the world and model it as well as it can by learning from the internet. And then there is an additional step where we shape the behavior of the neural network in a fairly fine-grained manner so that it acts in according to a high-level specification. So we design a high-level specification of the behavior of the neural network, and then we imprint it on it. And that second step, at present this is a step, though in the not too far future there'll be far more integrated, and there'll be one integrated step which produces the system which acts according to spec. This is the technical part of producing the system that you see if, for example, you use GPT-4. And indeed, it's been used by a lot of people so far, and it has resisted, let's say, people try to poke it quite intensively, and it has resisted quite well. But it is important to keep in mind that this is just the technical part of the problem,
Right.
which is very important, and it's going to be increasingly more important as the power of those systems increase. And the thing to remember, their power is going to be far greater than it is today. So the importance of making the system itself safe on the technical side will keep on increasing. But then in addition, we will want to see governments and society understand these AI systems and develop in a sense, antibodies to some of the concerns which Eric has outlined. I think he used the phrase, something with epistemic. It's about some phrase, and where it's hard to understand what is real and what is not. It may happen, but we also have but perhaps we will get used to not trusting blindly things that we read on the internet.
So just in a final sentence, can you say something about what you predict will happen?
Yeah. I mean, I believe someone really wise once said that predicting is hard, especially the future. I think it's fair to say, like if I were to make, here's what I predict will happen. I think AI will continue to make progress. I think we will see AI becoming the single most discussed subject in society. I think we will see a whole lot of people starting to think about the questions that are posed by AIs and starting to come up with creative and unexpected solutions that we haven't thought of yet. I think that we will see a huge number of incredible applications and incredible uses of AI, and we'll see lots of existing problems indeed starting to be solved. We'll see a huge amount of economic growth. And we'll also see new problems that are caused by AI that we've never seen before. I think all of these things will happen at the same time. The precise proportions are unpredictable. But yeah, it will be not boring.
A quick sentence.
Sure. So this is a remarkable time we're in. I've been doing AI since my first paper was 1984. And I've been through several paradigms, pushing hard, even pushing on this latest paradigm, even meeting with Jeff Hinton in 2005 and getting him to publish something that we could understand. It was a remarkable meeting we had to get moving in the field. I think that 500 years from now, the next 15 years will be recognizable. And I'm hoping for the best, but it'll be transformational. That transformation will include magical breakthroughs we didn't expect in the sciences. I'm optimistic it's going to go well, but there will be rough edges.
Okay, so in closing, can you please help us follow a CHM tradition and share a one word of advice?
Is it here? Mine is explore.
And why did you choose explore?
Oh, I think that's what I've been doing all my life, and it's such a human foundational aspiration to explore and learn.
Thank you. Ilya.
Mine is persevere. Because when things are going easy, it's pretty fun, and it doesn't take much effort to keep going, but when things are getting difficult, that's where perseverance matters, and these are the most decisive moments.
Well, thank you both, Eric and Ilya, for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Well. Wow. One last time, please give an applause for the panel in the previous time. Well, we heard about hopes, fears, predictions. We saw the foundation for everything that we're living with every day. And the word hallucination came up here. It didn't in the earlier panel, but I'm sure it was around then. So I knew I'd get some laughs from a few of you on that one. So thank you all so much for coming. This is, I think, a classic example of what our institution is aiming to do, is to bring forward from the context of the computing past and to have a conversation about the broader implications on the human condition. Because as I said in opening, life doesn't exist without computing, and it's going to be ever more fun in the future as a result. On a personal note, I've read those papers. I read them when I was in college a long time ago. And I encourage you, if you haven't read the earlier papers that were described, it's very much worth it. There's no question. And even rereading, if you're generally familiar, is really fundamental. And Diane, I want to thank you for moderating. I want to thank John as well. John was a long-running 20-year-plus trustee and still deeply involved in our collections process. And Diane's on our executive committee and doing a lot in higher education and also the broader field of computing in the diverse community as well. So we really appreciate all of what you're doing. And Eric and so many of the other people who are here tonight, I had a chance to work with in my time at Microsoft, and I can't thank you enough for all the things that you shared with me and you shared with everyone here tonight. So anyway, so thank you all tonight, and thanks for coming. Great, thanks so much.